The dust settled across the wooden platform of Silver Creek Station as Rose Lawrence watched the last passenger disembark from the train that had carried her across half the country. Her heart sank as she scanned the empty depot for the 100th time, the realization finally settling in her chest like a cold stone. Jonas Miller wasn't coming. The year was 1878, and Rose had traveled from Philadelphia to the Montana Territory with nothing but 2 trunks of belongings, a wedding dress carefully packed away, and the promise of a new life with a man she'd never met. 3 months of correspondence had culminated in a marriage proposal and a train ticket west. Now, as the afternoon sun beat down mercilessly on her pale skin, that promise had evaporated like morning dew. Last call for Silver Creek Station. The conductor shouted, already signaling to the engineer. Train continues to Fort Benton in 5 minutes. Rose clutched her handbag tighter, fighting back tears. 22 years old, and she had gambled everything on this journey. The station master gave her a pitying look as he moved past with a cart of mail sacks. "You waiting on someone, miss?" he asked, though his expression suggested he already knew the answer. "Mr. Jonas Miller," Rose replied, her voice smaller than she intended. "He was to meet me here today." The station master's face fell. Miller, from over at Copper Ridge. When Rose nodded, he removed his cap and twisted it in his hands. "I'm mighty sorry to tell you this, miss, but Jonas Miller was killed 3 weeks back. Mining accident. The whole town turned out for the burial." The blood drained from Rose's face. Dead, the man whose letters she'd read over and over, whose neat handwriting had described the home he was building for them, the land he was cultivating gone before she'd ever laid eyes on him. I don't understand," she stammered. "I received a telegram just last week confirming my arrival." The station master shook his head. "Don't rightly know about that. Telegraph office is run by young Billy Parker, and he ain't the most reliable sort." The train whistle blew, sharp and insistent. The conductor was boarding. "Last chance for Fort Benton," he called out. Rose stood frozen, unable to decide. Return to Philadelphia in shame? To what? She'd sold everything she owned to make this journey. Her parents were dead, her former position as a schoolteacher filled, her boarding room rented to another young woman. "Miss," the station master prompted gently. "Train's about to leave." The weight of her decision paralyzed her. The train's wheels began to turn, slowly at first, the great iron beast gathering momentum to continue its westward journey. "Wait." Rose called out, taking a step toward the train, but it was too late. The locomotive was already pulling away, the last car sliding past the platform. She was truly stranded. The station master offered her an awkward pat on the shoulder. "Town's got a small hotel, not fancy, but clean enough. I could have your trunks taken there while you figure things out." Rose nodded numbly, watching as he signaled to a young boy lounging against the station wall. The boy came running over, eager for the chance to earn a few cents. "Take the ladies' trunks to Widow Cooper's boarding house," the station master instructed. "Tell Mrs. Cooper to put it on my account for now." As the boy scrambled to follow orders, Rose sank onto a nearby bench, removing her bonnet to fan herself in the oppressive heat. What was she to do now? A proper lady didn't simply arrive unannounced in a frontier town with no connections, no husband, and no prospects. She was so lost in her thoughts that she didn't notice the tall figure approaching until his shadow fell across her. Looking up, Rose found herself staring into the bluest eyes she'd ever seen, set in a face tanned by the sun and framed by sandy hair that curled slightly at the collar of his shirt. "Madam," the man said, removing his well-worn Stetson, "couldn't help but notice you seem to be in some distress." "Nathan Walsh, at your service." He extended a calloused hand toward her, and after a moment's hesitation, Rose placed her gloved fingers in his. His grip was gentle but firm as he helped her to her feet. "Rose Lawrence," she replied, quickly withdrawing her hand and smoothing her travel-wrinkled skirts. It seems I find myself in rather difficult circumstances." Nathan nodded, his expression serious but kind. "I heard some of it. Jonas Miller's intended, you knew him." Rose asked, a flicker of hope kindling within her. "Not well," Nathan admitted. "Our ranches share a boundary line, seemed a decent sort." He paused, clearly weighing his next words carefully. Miss Lawrence, Silver Creek ain't Philadelphia. A woman alone out here faces challenges you might not be prepared for. Rose straightened her spine. I'm more resourceful than I appear, Mr. Walsh. A hint of a smile touched his lips. I don't doubt that, madam. Anyone who'd travel across the country to marry a stranger has got courage aplenty. He gestured toward the town's main street. Still, you'll need somewhere to stay while you decide what's next. Mrs. Cooper runs a respectable boarding house. I'd be happy to escort you there. Rose hesitated, her mother's warnings about strange men echoing in her mind. But there was something about Nathan Walsh, a steadiness in his gaze, an absence of guile that made her trust him despite her better judgment. That would be most appreciated, Mr. Walsh, she said finally. Nathan nodded once, then turned to the boy who was struggling with her trunks. Tommy, I'll take those. You run ahead and tell Mrs. Cooper she's got a guest coming. The boy scampered off, clearly relieved to be unburdened. Nathan effortlessly hoisted both trunks, one under each arm, as if they contained feathers rather than everything Rose owned in the world. As they walked the dusty main street of Silver Creek, Rose took in her surroundings with growing dismay. The town consisted of little more than a general store, a saloon, a small church, and a scattering of wooden buildings in various states of repair. It was a far cry from the bustling streets of Philadelphia with its gaslights and cobblestone roads. It ain't much to look at, Nathan said, reading her expression, but it's growing. The railroad coming through last year brought new folks. We've even got a schoolhouse now, though no permanent teacher. Rose perked up at this information. I was a teacher in Philadelphia. Nathan glanced at her with newfound interest. Is that so? Might be worth talking to Mayor Simmons then. Town council's been trying to find someone qualified. For the first time since the station master's devastating news, Rose felt a glimmer of hope. Perhaps all was not lost after all, Mrs. Cooper's boarding house stood at the edge of town, a tidy two-story structure with a small garden out front. The widow herself met them at the door, a plump, gray-haired woman with sharp eyes that took in Rose's fine clothes and Nathan's presence with obvious curiosity. So you're the girl who was to marry poor Jonas, she said without preamble. Terrible business, that mine collapse. Come in, I've got a room ready. Nathan set the trunks down in the modest parlor. Miss Lawrence was a schoolteacher back east, Mrs. Cooper. Thought she might want to speak with the mayor about our vacant position. Mrs. Cooper brightened. Oh my, wouldn't that be something? The children have been running wild since Miss Perkins left to marry that cattle buyer from Wyoming. I would very much like to inquire about the position, Rose confirmed, warming to the idea with each passing moment. Nathan, be a dear and fetch the mayor for supper, Mrs. Cooper said. I was planning to feed him anyway. That man can't cook worth beans since his Martha passed, and this way Miss Lawrence can speak with him directly. Nathan replaced his hat. Happy to, Mrs. Cooper. Miss Lawrence, I'll take my leave for now, but I'll return with Mayor Simmons by 6 if that suits. That would be fine, Mr. Walsh, Rose replied, suddenly reluctant to see him go. He represented the only friendly face she'd encountered since arriving. And thank you for your kindness. Something flickered in his eyes, surprise, perhaps, or pleasure at her gratitude. Just being neighborly, madam. That's how we survive out here, by looking out for one another. With a tip of his hat, he was gone, leaving Rose to follow Mrs. Cooper up the narrow staircase to what would be her temporary home. The room was small but clean, with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a small desk beneath the window that overlooked the main street. Mrs. Cooper helped her unpack the essentials, clucking sympathetically over Rose's wedding dress when they uncovered it. Such fine work, the older woman said, running weathered fingers over the delicate lace. Seems a shame to waste it. Perhaps it won't go to waste, Rose said, more to comfort herself than from any real conviction. Mrs. Cooper gave her a knowing look. I saw how Nathan Walsh was watching you. Never known him to escort a lady anywhere before, not since he came back from the war. Rose felt heat rise in her cheeks. Mr. Walsh was simply being kind to a stranger in distress, nothing more. If you say so, dear, Mrs. Cooper replied with a smile that suggested she believed otherwise. Now, let's get you freshened up before the mayor arrives. First impressions matter, especially when you're asking for a job. As Rose washed away the dust of travel, she found her thoughts returning to Nathan Walsh. There had been something compelling about him, not just his physical presence, though she couldn't deny he was a handsome man, but the quiet confidence he exuded. He hadn't offered her empty platitudes or treated her as helpless, despite her obvious predicament. By the time she had changed into a fresh dress and Mrs. Cooper had helped her restyle her chestnut hair, Rose had resolved to focus on the practical matter at hand, securing employment. Romantic notions about blue-eyed cowboys had no place in her current circumstances. Mayor Simmons arrived promptly at 6, accompanied by Nathan. The mayor proved to be a portly man with mutton chop whiskers and an expansive manner. He listened attentively as Rose described her educational background and teaching experience in Philadelphia. 3 years at the Franklin Academy for Young Ladies, he mused, clearly impressed. And you can teach music as well. My dear Miss Lawrence, you're precisely what our little community needs. When can you start? Rose blinked, taken aback by his enthusiasm. Well, I would need to see the schoolhouse prepare lessons. Of course, the mayor agreed hastily. Say Monday next, that gives you a week to settle in. Salary is $40 a month with room and board included. The teachers' quarters are attached to the schoolhouse, small but private. It was less than half what she'd earned in Philadelphia, but the addition of housing made it a reasonable offer. That sounds acceptable, Mayor Simmons. Excellent, the mayor beamed, helping himself to more of Mrs. Cooper's beef stew. Nathan, you'll show Miss Lawrence the schoolhouse tomorrow. Nathan, who had been quietly observing the exchange, nodded. Happy to, if Miss Lawrence is agreeable. That would be most helpful, Mr. Walsh, Rose replied, trying to ignore the flutter in her stomach at the prospect of seeing him again. The conversation turned to other town matters, and Rose learned that Nathan's ranch, the Double W, was one of the largest in the area. He'd inherited it from his uncle after returning from fighting in the war between the states and had spent the last decade building it into a successful operation. Nathan's too modest to mention it, Mayor Simmons said, but he's the reason we've got a doctor in town now, donated the land and half the lumber for the clinic. Nathan looked uncomfortable with the praise. Town needs a doctor made good business sense. And the fact that you paid Dr. Harrison's salary for the first 6 months was just business too, I suppose? Mrs. Cooper added with a sly smile. Rose watched as Nathan shifted in his chair, clearly embarrassed by their admiration. It was an endearing quality in a man who, by all accounts, was one of the most influential citizens in Silver Creek. After dinner, Nathan excused himself, promising to return the following morning to show Rose the schoolhouse. As he took his leave, he paused in the doorway. Miss Lawrence, if there's anything you need in the meantime, Mrs. Cooper knows how to reach me. Thank you, Mr. Walsh, Rose replied, suddenly conscious of the mayor and Mrs. Cooper watching them with interest. Once he had gone, Mrs. Cooper couldn't contain herself. Well, I never thought I'd see the day Nathan Walsh took such an interest in a newcomer. He usually keeps to himself, that one. Mrs. Cooper, Rose protested, Mr. Walsh is simply being kind to a stranger. Kind, yes, the widow agreed, but Nathan Walsh has a reputation for being private. Been half the eligible women in the territory trying to catch his eye since he arrived, and none succeeded. She patted Rose's hand. Don't underestimate the power of being something new and different in a place like Silver Creek, my dear. Rose retired to her room that night with Mrs. Cooper's words echoing in her mind. She hadn't come west to find a husband, or rather she had, but that husband was now buried in the Silver Creek Cemetery. The thought of Jonas Miller brought a fresh wave of grief, not for the man himself, whom she'd never met, but for the future she'd imagined. She took out his letters, reading them again by the light of the oil lamp. His handwriting had been neat and precise, his words thoughtful if not particularly passionate. He described the land he was developing, the house he'd built, his hopes for starting a family. It had been enough for Rose, whose options in Philadelphia had been limited after her parents' deaths left her with little more than debts. Would she have grown to love Jonas Miller? Rose would never know. But as she prepared for bed in the unfamiliar room, She found herself wondering instead about Nathan Walsh's ranch, and what kind of home he had built in this wild country. Morning came with the crowing of Mrs. Cooper's rooster and the smell of coffee and frying bacon. Rose dressed carefully in one of her more practical dresses, a blue calico that wouldn't show dust as readily as her finer clothes. She was just pinning her hair when Mrs. Cooper called up the stairs. "Miss Lawrence, Mr. Walsh is here for you." Rose took a final glance in the small mirror, smoothing a stray strand of hair, then chided herself for her vanity. This was a business arrangement, nothing more. Nathan stood in the parlor, hat in hand, looking impossibly tall in the small room. He'd clearly made an effort with his appearance. His shirt was crisp, his dark trousers free of dust, his boots polished to a shine. "Good morning, Miss Lawrence," he said, a slight smile softening his features. "Ready to see your new workplace?" "Good morning, Mr. Walsh." "Yes, I'm quite eager to assess what supplies might be needed before classes begin." Mrs. Cooper pressed a basket into Rose's hands. "I've packed a light lunch for you both. No sense rushing back if you're taking inventory." Before Rose could protest, they were out the door and walking down Silver Creek's Main Street. The town was more active than it had been the previous afternoon, with shopkeepers sweeping their storefronts and wagons delivering goods to the general store. "Town's growing," Nathan commented, nodding to various people as they passed. "Railroads changed everything. Used to take weeks to get supplies from back east, now it's days." "It must have been very isolated before," Rose observed. "It was, still is compared to what you're used to." "Winters can be harsh here, snow so deep you can't open your door some mornings." He glanced at her. "That worry you?" Rose considered the question seriously. "I won't pretend I'm accustomed to such conditions, but I'm not afraid of challenges, Mr. Walsh." He studied her for a moment, then nodded as if she'd passed some test. "Call me Nathan. Mr. Walsh makes me feel like my uncle." The familiarity was premature by Philadelphia standards, but Rose reminded herself she wasn't in Philadelphia anymore. "Then you must call me Rose." The schoolhouse stood at the far end of town, a sturdy building with large windows and a small bell tower. Attached to one side was a modest dwelling that would serve as Rose's new home. "It's not much," Nathan said as he unlocked the door, "but it's solid." "Built it myself, along with some of the other men in town." "You built this?" Rose asked, impressed as she stepped inside. "Helped build it," he corrected. "Mayor Simmons had the plans drawn up by a real architect from Denver. I just supplied some of the lumber and labor." The schoolroom was larger than Rose had expected, with rows of benches and desks, a black slate board on the wall, and shelves for books and supplies. Many frontier schools she'd heard about were little more than shacks with dirt floors. "This is quite impressive for a town this size," she remarked, running her fingers along the teacher's desk at the front of the room. "We take education seriously here," Nathan said. "Most of us didn't have much schooling growing up, want better for our children." Rose opened the cabinet behind the desk, finding a small collection of textbooks, slates, and chalk. "How many students will I have?" "About 20, ranging from 6 to 16. Some can only attend when they're not needed for planting or harvest." "The Miller children," he broke off, looking apologetic. "I'm sorry, that must be difficult to hear." "Jonas had children?" Rose asked, her heart sinking. This was a detail the letters had omitted. No, Nathan quickly corrected. "Different Miller family, no relation to Jonas that I know of." Relief washed over her. The idea of becoming an instant mother to orphan children would have been overwhelming on top of everything else. They moved on to inspect the teacher's quarters, a simple but comfortable two-room dwelling with a small kitchen, a bedroom, and a sitting area. It was sparsely furnished but clean, with curtains at the windows and a colorful quilt on the bed. "The women of the church made the quilt for Miss Perkins, the last teacher," Nathan explained. "They'll likely do something similar for you once you're settled." Rose was touched by this evidence of community spirit. "Everyone has been so kind, I expected," she hesitated. "Expected what?" Nathan prompted. "To be viewed with suspicion, I suppose, an outsider and one with an unusual arrival." Nathan leaned against the doorframe, considering her words. "Silver Creek's not like some places. We need new blood, new ideas. And folks respect courage." Takes courage to travel across the country to marry a man you've never met. His direct reference to her situation made Rose blush. It wasn't courage so much as necessity, I'm afraid. My options in Philadelphia were limited after my parents died. Limited how? He asked, genuine interest in his expression. Rose moved to the window, looking out at the mountains in the distance. My father was a professor at a small college. When he and my mother died of influenza 2 years ago, I discovered he had accumulated significant debts. Our home, his books, everything had to be sold. I had my teaching position, but the salary barely covered my room and board. When I saw an advertisement seeking correspondence with ladies willing to consider marriage in the territories, she shrugged. It seemed an adventure, at least. Nathan was quiet for a moment. Jonas was lucky, even if he never got to meet you. The simple sincerity in his voice made Rose turn to face him. You're very kind to say so. Not kind, just truthful. He pushed away from the doorframe. Should we look at those supplies now? Make a list of what you need before school starts. They spent the next hour taking inventory of the schoolroom, with Rose making careful notes about additional books, paper, and other materials that would be needed. Nathan offered practical insights about the children she would be teaching, which families valued education, which might need extra encouragement to send their children regularly. By midday, they had completed a thorough assessment, and Nathan suggested they eat the lunch Mrs. Cooper had packed. They sat on the schoolhouse steps, sharing bread, cheese, and apple tarts while Nathan pointed out landmarks visible from their position. That's Raven Ridge, he said, indicating a dark line of cliffs to the northwest. Beyond that is my ranch. About 5 miles as the crow flies, twice that by road. It must be beautiful, Rose said, imagining vast open spaces so different from Philadelphia's crowded streets. It is, he agreed. Harsh sometimes, but beautiful. 40 acres of good grazing land with a creek running through it. House sits on a rise so you can see for miles. You built the house yourself as well. Started with a cabin my uncle left, added to it over the years. It's comfortable enough now. He seemed self-conscious suddenly, as if worried he'd said too much. What about you? What was your home like in Philadelphia? Rose described the modest townhouse where she'd grown up, with its tiny garden and her father's overwhelming collection of books that had filled every available space. As she spoke, she realized how distant that life already seemed, like a story she'd read rather than lived. I miss the libraries most, she concluded. There's so little to read out here, Nathan smiled. Might surprise you, I've got quite a collection myself. Nothing scholarly like your father's, I expect, but I read when I can. Happy to lend you books anytime. Rose's estimation of him rose further. A cowboy who valued books was an unexpected find in the Montana territory. They returned to Mrs. Cooper's by mid-afternoon, with Nathan promising to arrange for Rose's belongings to be moved to the teacher's quarters the following day. As they reached the boarding house, he hesitated. There's a social at the church tomorrow evening. Welcome for new folks, mostly, but everyone attends. Would you consider going as my guest? He added quickly, strictly proper of course. Mrs. Cooper will be there and the pastor's wife. Rose found herself nodding before she'd fully considered the implications. I would like that, thank you. The smile that lit up his face was worth any potential impropriety. I'll come by around 6 then. After he departed, Mrs. Cooper was full of questions about the schoolhouse and, more pointedly, about Nathan's invitation to the social. He's never escorted anyone to a town gathering before, the widow marveled. Always comes alone and leaves alone. Mrs. Cooper, please, Rose protested. Mr. Walsh, Nathan is simply being hospitable to a newcomer. I'm sure he would do the same for any lady arriving in such circumstances. If you say so, dear, Mrs. Cooper replied, with the same knowing smile she'd worn the previous day. Now, let's see what we can do about freshening up that green dress of yours for tomorrow night. First impressions at a social matter almost as much as for a job interview, as Rose helped Mrs. Cooper prepare supper, her thoughts kept returning to Nathan Walsh. There was something compelling about his quiet strength, his understated kindness. In Philadelphia, She had received occasional attention from young men at church socials and literary gatherings, but none had affected her the way Nathan did, with just a look or a simple word. It was foolish, she knew, to entertain such thoughts when she'd known him barely a day. She had come to Montana to marry Jonas Miller, and that man lay in a grave she hadn't even visited yet. Propriety demanded a period of mourning, even if her relationship with the deceased had been conducted entirely through letters. Yet as she lay in bed that night, Rose found herself anticipating the social with an excitement that had little to do with meeting the townsfolk and everything to do with the man who would escort her there. The next day passed in a flurry of activity. Nathan arrived with a wagon in the morning to transport her trunks to the teacher's quarters, and Rose spent several hours arranging her belongings in what would be her new home. Mrs. Cooper accompanied her, offering advice on how to make the small space more comfortable and introducing her to several women who stopped by to welcome the new teacher. By late afternoon, they had returned to the boarding house so Rose could prepare for the social. The green dress, freshly pressed, and with a new ribbon threaded through the collar courtesy of Mrs. Cooper, was the finest thing she had brought west. It was modest by Philadelphia standards, but would likely be considered quite formal in Silver Creek. Nathan arrived precisely at 6, looking so transformed that Rose almost didn't recognize him. Gone were the work clothes and dusty boots, replaced by a dark suit, crisp white shirt, and polished shoes. His hair was neatly combed, though a rebellious lock still curled over his forehead. "You look beautiful," he said simply, his blue eyes warm with admiration. "As do you," Rose replied, then blushed at her forward response. "That is, you look very handsome, Mr. Nathan." He offered his arm with a smile. "Shall we?" The church was the largest building in Silver Creek after the saloon, a fact that Pastor Williams mentioned with both humor and resignation during his welcoming speech. Nearly everyone in town seemed to be in attendance, from the oldest grandmother to the youngest infant. Rose was introduced to so many people that she feared she would never remember all their names, but everyone was welcoming, expressing delight that their children would have a teacher again. "You're something of a celebrity," Nathan murmured as they moved toward the refreshment table after another round of introductions. "Haven't seen the town this excited since Dr. Harrison arrived. It's overwhelming," Rose admitted. In Philadelphia, one could live next door to people for years and never exchange more than polite greetings. "That's the difference," Nathan said, handing her a cup of punch. "Out here, your neighbors aren't just people who happen to live nearby. They're the ones who'll help raise your barn when it falls, who'll ride 20 miles to fetch the doctor if you're sick, who'll take in your children if something happens to you." His expression grew serious. "Community isn't a luxury here, it's how we survive." Rose thought about his words as they joined a group that included the mayor, the doctor and his wife, and several ranchers with their families. The conversation flowed easily from cattle prices to weather predictions to gentle teasing about who had the best garden in town. Through it all, Nathan kept a protective presence at her side, quietly explaining local references she didn't understand, introducing her to newcomers who approached. When the pastor announced it was time for dancing, Rose hesitated. In Philadelphia, dancing was a carefully choreographed affair with strict rules of etiquette. Here, it seemed more spontaneous, with couples already forming sets for what appeared to be a lively square dance. "May I have this dance?" Nathan asked, extending his hand. "I'm afraid I don't know the steps," Rose confessed. "I'll teach you," he promised. "It's not so different from your Eastern dances, just a bit more enthusiastic." That proved to be an understatement. The fiddle and banjo struck up a lively tune, and Rose found herself swept into a whirl of movement, with Nathan's strong hands guiding her through the unfamiliar patterns. She stumbled a few times, laughing at her own mistakes, but no one seemed to mind. By the end of the dance, she was flushed with exertion and enjoyment. "You're a natural," Nathan said as he led her to a bench along the wall. "Hardly, but it was fun," Rose replied, fanning herself with her hand. "Much more spirited than the dances I'm accustomed to." "Everything's a bit more spirited out here," he said with a smile. As the evening progressed, Rose found herself relaxing, drawn into the warm camaraderie of the community. She danced again with Nathan, and then with the mayor and several other men who politely requested the honor. But it was always to Nathan she returned between dances, finding comfort in his steady presence. Near the end of the evening, as the gathering began to thin, Nathan suggested they step outside for some air. The night was clear, with stars scattered across the sky like diamonds on black velvet. "I've never seen so many stars," Rose marveled, looking up. "In Philadelphia, the gaslights and coal smoke obscure most of them." "It's one of the things I love most about this country," Nathan said, standing close beside her. "Makes a man feel small, but in a good way. Reminds you that your problems ain't so big in the grand scheme." Rose glanced at him, curious. "Do you have many problems, Nathan?" He was quiet for a moment, his profile outlined in silver by the moonlight. "No more than most, I reckon. Ranch keeps me busy, gets lonely sometimes." The simple admission hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. Rose felt a surge of empathy, recognizing in him the same solitude she had known in Philadelphia after her parents' deaths. "I understand loneliness," she said softly. "Even surrounded by people in the city, I often felt completely alone." Nathan turned to face her, his expression solemn. "Rose, I know it's too soon and probably improper for me to say this, but I'm glad Jonas Miller wasn't at that train station yesterday." The words should have shocked her, perhaps even angered her, but instead, Rose felt a flutter of something like hope. "That's a terrible thing to say," she whispered, but without conviction. "I know," he acknowledged, "and I'm sorry for it. Jonas was a decent man by all accounts. He didn't deserve what happened to him." He reached out hesitantly and took her hand. "But if he had been there, I wouldn't be standing here with you now, and that thought troubles me more than it should, given I've known you barely 2 days." Rose knew she should withdraw her hand, maintain the proper distance between them. Instead, she found herself tightening her grip. "I hardly know what to say." "You don't need to say anything," Nathan assured her. "I don't expect anything from you, Rose. I just wanted you to know that I'm glad you're here, despite the circumstances that brought you." Before she could respond, the church door opened, spilling light and conversation into the night. Nathan released her hand as Mrs. Cooper emerged, looking around until she spotted them. "Ah, there you are. I was wondering where you'd disappeared to." If the widow suspected any impropriety, she gave no sign of it. "It's getting late and an old woman needs her rest. Ready to head back, Rose?" "Of course, Mrs. Cooper." Rose turned to Nathan. "Thank you for a lovely evening." "The pleasure was mine," he replied formally, but his eyes conveyed a deeper meaning. As they walked back to the boarding house, Mrs. Cooper chatted about the social, seemingly oblivious to Rose's distracted responses. Rose's mind was spinning with Nathan's words and the feelings they had awakened in her. Was it possible to develop genuine affection for someone in such a short time? Or was she simply responding to his kindness, grasping at the first friendly hand extended to her in this strange new place? Tomorrow she would move into the teacher's quarters and begin preparing for her new role. Perhaps with some distance and the distraction of work, she could sort out her confused emotions. But as she fell asleep that night, it was Nathan's face she saw, his words that echoed in her mind. "I'm glad you're here." The next morning brought practical matters to the fore. Nathan arrived with his wagon to transport the last of her belongings to the schoolhouse, and by noon, Rose was officially installed in the teacher's quarters. Mrs. Cooper had packed a basket of food to tide her over until she could arrange regular meals, and Nathan had brought a housewarming gift that touched Rose deeply. A small bookshelf he had made himself, already stocked with a dozen volumes from his personal library. "It's not much of a collection," he said as she ran her fingers over the spines, "but it's a start. Thought you might like something to read in the evenings." "It's perfect," Rose replied, genuinely moved by his thoughtfulness. "Thank you, Nathan." He looked pleased by her reaction. "I should let you get settled. Unless there's anything else you need help with." What Rose needed most was time to think, to establish some equilibrium in her new surroundings without the distraction of Nathan's presence. "I believe I have everything I need for now, thank you." He nodded, understanding in his eyes. "I'll be heading back to the ranch then. Got cattle that need tending." He paused at the door. "The invitation to visit stands, anytime you'd like to see more of the country around here." "I'll keep that in mind," Rose promised. Walking him to the door for a moment, they stood on the threshold, neither quite ready to part. Then Nathan took her hand, raised it briefly to his lips in a gesture that would have been commonplace in Philadelphia, but seemed startlingly intimate here in the doorway of her new home. "Until next time, Rose," he said softly, then released her hand and strode toward his waiting wagon. Rose watched him go, her hand still tingling from the brief contact. Then, with a determined shake of her head, she turned back to the task of organizing her new home. There was much to do before Monday, when she would face 20 curious children expecting to be educated. The next few days passed in a flurry of activity. Rose met with Mayor Simmons to discuss the curriculum and visited each family with school-aged children to introduce herself. Everywhere she went, she was received warmly, often with invitations to stay for a meal or at least a cup of coffee. By Sunday, she felt she had a good understanding of the community she would be serving and the varied needs of her future students. She attended church service that morning, taking a seat beside Mrs. Cooper. Rose was conscious of the curious glances sent her way, but they were friendly rather than judgmental. Pastor Williams even acknowledged her presence from the pulpit, asking the congregation to welcome the new teacher and support her efforts to educate their children. Rose had hoped and feared in equal measure that Nathan might be present, but he was noticeably absent. When she inquired casually to Mrs. Cooper after the service, the widow explained that the ranchers who lived furthest from town often couldn't make the journey every week, particularly during busy seasons. "Nathan tries to come when he can, but the ranch demands much of his time, especially with no wife to manage the household while he tends the cattle," Mrs. Cooper added with a meaningful look that Rose pretended not to notice. Monday morning arrived clear and cool, with a hint of autumn in the air. Rose dressed carefully in one of her plainest dresses, her hair neatly pinned back, determined to project an image of quiet authority. The school bell, which she rang precisely at 8 o'clock, seemed to echo across the entire town. Children began arriving shortly after, some alone, others accompanied by parents eager to meet the new teacher. Rose greeted each one by name, having memorized her list of students and directed them to seats appropriate to their ages. By 8:30, 19 children ranging from 6 to 16 were seated before her, expressions varying from excitement to trepidation to outright skepticism. "Good morning," Rose began, her voice steady despite her nerves. "I am Miss Lawrence, and I am very pleased to be your new teacher." The day that followed was both exhausting and exhilarating. Rose assessed each child's level of knowledge, finding that some of the older ones had received surprisingly good education from previous teachers, while others, particularly those who had moved to the area recently, needed significant remedial work. She organized them into groups based on ability rather than age, an approach that seemed to work well for the varied levels present. By the time the last child departed at 3 o'clock, Rose was tired but satisfied. She had connected with most of her students, established clear expectations, and laid the groundwork for the lessons to come. As she sat at her desk planning the next day's activities, there was a knock at the schoolhouse door. Expecting perhaps a parent with a question, Rose was surprised to find Nathan standing there, his hat in his hands. "Nathan, I wasn't expecting to see you today." He shifted slightly, looking almost bashful. "Thought I'd ride in and see how your first day went. Plus, I brought you these." From behind his back, he produced a bouquet of wildflowers, their colors vibrant against the fading light of afternoon. "They're beautiful," Rose said, accepting them with genuine pleasure. "Thank you, won't you come in? I was just finishing up for the day." Nathan followed her inside, glancing around at the schoolroom with its rows of desks, now empty of children. "How did it go? The children behaved themselves." "For the most part," Rose replied, filling a jar with water for the flowers. Tommy Jenkins tried to put a frog in Rebecca Miller's lunch pail, but otherwise it was quite civilized. Nathan laughed. "Tommy's always been a handful, his pa's the same way, full of mischief but good-hearted." I think we came to an understanding, Rose said with a smile, remembering how the boy had looked equal parts defiant and contrite when caught. He has a quick mind when he chooses to apply it. They fell into easy conversation about the school day, with Nathan offering insights into the families of various children that helped Rose better understand their circumstances. As they talked, she prepared tea in her small kitchen, and they sat at her little table, the domesticity of the scene striking Rose with unexpected force. This is how it could be, she thought, then immediately chastised herself for such forward thinking. They had known each other less than a week. I've been thinking, Nathan said after a comfortable lull in the conversation. Saturday is the Harvest Festival. Whole town turns out for it, games for the children, dancing, a big communal supper. Would you consider attending with me? Rose hesitated. Their relationship, whatever it was, seemed to be progressing at a pace that would have scandalized Philadelphia society. Yet here, in this frontier community with its different standards and necessities, perhaps such rapid connections were normal. I would like that, she said finally. Though I'm sure I'll be attending anyway as the new teacher. True enough, Nathan acknowledged with a smile, but I'd like it to be understood that you're there with me specifically. His directness was both alarming and refreshing. I don't want to rush you, Rose. I know you came here expecting a different life with a different man. If you need time, or if your feelings don't run in the same direction as mine, I'll understand. Rose looked down at her teacup, gathering her thoughts. Nathan, I hardly know what my feelings are. Everything has happened so quickly. A week ago, I was on a train expecting to meet my future husband. Now I'm sitting in a schoolhouse I never expected to see, having tea with a man I never expected to meet. She raised her eyes to his. I need time to find my footing here. Nathan nodded, his expression serious. That's fair, more than fair. He reached across the table, not quite touching her hand, but close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his skin. I'll wait, Rose, however long you need. The simple promise, made without dramatics or demands, touched something deep within her. This man, with his quiet strength and unwavering kindness, was unlike anyone she had known in Philadelphia. There, men had courted her with flowery words and extravagant compliments that never quite rang true. Nathan offered only honesty and patience, and somehow that meant more than all the poetry in the world. Thank you, she said softly. The week that followed fell into a pattern. Rose taught during the day, gradually gaining confidence in her role and building relationships with her students. In the evenings, she prepared lessons, read from the books Nathan had lent her, and occasionally accepted dinner invitations from the families of her pupils. Nathan rode into town twice more, once ostensibly to speak with the blacksmith whose son was struggling with reading, and once openly to bring Rose a basket of apples from the small orchard on his ranch. Each visit deepened their connection as they talked about books they had read, childhood memories, hopes for the future. Rose found herself looking forward to these conversations with an eagerness that both thrilled and frightened her. By Saturday, the day of the Harvest Festival, Rose had admitted to herself what her heart had known almost from the beginning. She was falling in love with Nathan Walsh. The realization should have terrified her. It was too soon, too unexpected, too contrary to everything she had planned. Instead, it filled her with a quiet joy, a sense that perhaps the universe had a different path for her than the one she had envisioned. The festival was held in the large meadow behind the church, where tables had been set up for the communal supper and a wooden platform constructed for dancing. When Nathan arrived to escort her, Rose was ready in her best dress, a deep blue that brought out the auburn highlights in her hair. You look lovely, he said, his admiration evident in his eyes. Thank you, Rose replied, suddenly shy despite the growing comfort between them. You look quite handsome yourself. The festival was everything a small town celebration should be. Children running three-legged races and bobbing for apples, women proudly displaying their preserves and needlework, men competing in horseshoe pitching and tests of strength. The air was filled with laughter, music, and the mouth-watering smells of roasting meat and fresh bread. Rose found herself drawn into the heart of the community, recognized now not just as the mail-order bride who had been stood up, but as Miss Lawrence, the teacher who had already made an impression on the town's children. Nathan stayed close by her side, introducing her to ranchers who lived too far out to have met her yet, dancing with her when the fiddlers struck up a tune, making sure her plate was filled with the best offerings from the communal table. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the meadow, Nathan took her hand. "Walk with me, there's something I'd like to show you." He led her away from the festivities up a small hill that overlooked the town. From this vantage point, Rose could see all of Silver Creek spread out before her, the lights from lanterns and windows creating a constellation of warmth in the gathering dusk. "It's beautiful," she said, gazing at the scene below. "This is where I come sometimes when I need to think," Nathan said, his voice quiet in the still evening air. "When I first came back from the war, I was lost, angry, couldn't see much point in anything. My uncle had just died, leaving me the ranch I didn't know how to run. I'd ride up here and just sit for hours, watching the town, reminding myself that life was still happening, that people were still living normal lives despite everything I'd seen." Rose turned to look at him, moved by this glimpse into his past. "And it helped, eventually," he nodded. "Took time. But this place has a way of healing a person if you let it." He met her eyes, his expression earnest. "Rose, I know you didn't choose to come to Silver Creek, not really. You chose Jonas and fate brought you here instead, but I want you to know that I think you belong here. Not just as our teacher, but as part of this community. As part of—" He hesitated, then pressed on. "As part of my life, if you'll consider it." Rose's heart beat faster at his words. "Nathan, are you not proposing?" he quickly assured her. "Not yet. That would be rushing things, and I promised you time." He took both her hands in his. "I'm just telling you that I've never felt about anyone the way I feel about you, and I wanted you to know that before you decide whether Silver Creek is where you want to stay." Rose looked down at their joined hands, then back up at his face, open and vulnerable in the fading light. "I came west seeking a new beginning," she said slowly. "It didn't start the way I expected, but perhaps it's leading exactly where I'm meant to be." Nathan's smile was like the sunrise. "Is that a yes? You'll stay?" "It's a maybe," Rose replied, but her eyes told a different story. "Ask me again in a month or two," he laughed, the sound rich with joy and promise. "I can be patient." As they walked back down the hill toward the lights and music of the festival, hand in hand, Rose thought about the twist of fate that had brought her here, not to Jonas Miller's home as his bride, but to Silver Creek as its teacher and to Nathan Walsh as— what? Not his fiancé, not yet. But something more than a friend, something with the potential to grow into a love deeper and truer than anything she had imagined when she boarded that train in Philadelphia. The next month passed in a blur of teaching, community events, and increasingly frequent visits from Nathan. He began riding into town several times a week, sometimes just for an hour to bring her a book or share a cup of coffee, sometimes for an entire evening spent in conversation by the fire in her small sitting room. Rose's students thrived under her tutelage, even Tommy Jenkins, who had appointed himself her unofficial assistant after she recognized and encouraged his aptitude for mathematics. The parents expressed their gratitude with gifts of fresh eggs, homemade bread, and invitations to Sunday dinners. Gradually, Rose felt herself becoming part of the fabric of Silver Creek, no longer an outsider but a valued member of the community. As October turned to November, the weather grew colder, with the first snow dusting the mountains that ringed the valley. Nathan's visits took on a new purpose, as he helped Rose prepare her small home for winter, showing her how to properly bank a fire to last through the night, installing extra insulation around the windows, making sure she had an adequate supply of firewood stacked by the door. "Montana winters are no joke," he warned as they worked together one Saturday afternoon. "Last year we had snow so deep it reached the windowsills. You need to be prepared." "I'm beginning to think I should have brought more woolen stockings," Rose replied, only half joking. She had already discovered that her Philadelphia wardrobe was woefully inadequate for the harsh climate of the territory. "Mrs. Peterson at the general store just got in a shipment of winter goods," Nathan suggested. "Might be worth a visit." Rose nodded, adding it to her mental list of preparations. "Nathan, may I ask you something?" Anything, he replied, pausing in his work of sealing a drafty crack in the window frame. Do you think? Would it be improper of me to visit Jonas Miller's grave? The question had been on her mind for weeks, but she had hesitated to voice it. Unsure of Nathan's reaction, he considered her question seriously. I don't think it would be improper. You came all this way to marry him. Paying your respects seems right. Would you take me there? I don't even know where the cemetery is. Of course, Nathan agreed. Tomorrow after church if you'd like. It's not far from town. The next day dawned clear and cold, the sun casting long shadows across the freshly fallen snow. After the church service, Nathan helped Rose into his wagon for the short journey to the small cemetery on the outskirts of Silver Creek. They drove in companionable silence, each lost in their own thoughts. The cemetery was a peaceful place with simple wooden crosses and stone markers set in neat rows. Nathan led Rose to a relatively new grave in the back corner, the earth still slightly mounded despite the covering of snow. Jonas Miller, Rose read from the marker. Beloved son and friend. 1844–1878. It was strange to stand before the grave of a man she had been prepared to spend her life with, yet had never met. She felt a complex mixture of emotions: sadness for a life cut short, regret for the future that might have been, yet also a growing certainty that fate had perhaps been kind in its cruelty. I'll give you a moment, Nathan said quietly, moving a short distance away to provide privacy. Rose knelt beside the grave, brushing snow from the marker with her gloved hand. I wish I had known you, she whispered. I think perhaps we might have built a good life together. I hope you're at peace. She remained there for several minutes, saying a silent prayer for the man who had unknowingly changed the course of her life. When she finally rose and turned back toward Nathan, she felt a sense of closure, as if a chapter had ended and a new one could truly begin. Thank you for bringing me here, she said as he helped her back into the wagon. You needed to say goodbye, Nathan replied simply. They rode back toward town, but at a crossroads, Nathan unexpectedly turned the wagon away from Silver Creek. Where are we going? Rose asked, surprised. I thought, if you're willing, I might show you my ranch. He glanced at her, a question in his eyes. It's not far, and I'd have you back before dark. Rose felt a flutter of excitement at the prospect. She had been curious about Nathan's home since he first mentioned it. I'd like that very much. The Double W Ranch lay nestled in a valley between rolling hills, protected from the worst of the winter winds by a stand of pine trees along its northern border. As they crested the final rise, Rose caught her breath at the sight spread before her. A substantial two-story house built of solid logs, a large barn and several outbuildings, and beyond them, pastures where cattle grazed despite the light covering of snow. Nathan, it's beautiful, she exclaimed. He looked pleased by her reaction. It's taken years to build it up to this, started with just the cabin and a few dozen head of cattle. As they drew closer, Rose could see that the main house, while constructed of logs, was far from a rustic cabin. It had large windows, a wide covered porch, and a stone chimney from which smoke curled invitingly into the clear sky. Nathan helped her down from the wagon and led her toward the house. Mrs. Harmon, my housekeeper, comes in 3 days a week to keep things in order, but she's not here today. Hope you don't mind it not being properly prepared for visitors. Not at all, Rose assured him, touched by his concern for proprieties even in this informal visit. The interior of the house was a revelation. Rose had expected a bachelor's sparse quarters, but instead found comfortable, well-made furniture, colorful rugs on the polished wood floors, and walls lined with bookshelves. A fire blazed in the large stone hearth, casting a warm glow over the main room. Your home is lovely, Rose said, moving toward the bookshelves that drew her like a magnet. And your library, you didn't exaggerate. Nathan watched with evident pleasure as she examined his collection. Been gathering books since I was a boy. My mother taught me to read before she died, and I never lost the habit. Rose ran her fingers along the spines, recognizing classics, histories, scientific treatises, and even some poetry. This would be considered an impressive library even in Philadelphia. Help yourself to any that interest you, Nathan offered. There's no lending period and no late fees. Rose laughed at his jest, selecting a volume of Tennyson's poems that caught her eye. As she turned back to him, she found him watching her with an expression that made her heart skip a beat. "What is it?" she asked softly. "Just thinking how right you look here," he replied, his voice equally low. "As if you belong." The moment stretched between them, charged with unspoken possibilities. Then Nathan cleared his throat, breaking the spell. "Would you like to see the rest of the house?" He showed her through the downstairs rooms, a formal dining room, a study with a desk positioned to catch the morning light, a kitchen with a large wood-burning stove and well-stocked pantry. Upstairs were 4 bedrooms, simply but comfortably furnished. "More space than I need," Nathan acknowledged as they returned downstairs, "but I always hoped." He trailed off, but Rose understood. He had built this house with a family in mind. They took tea in the kitchen, sitting at a large wooden table that Nathan mentioned he had made himself. As they talked, Rose found herself imagining what life might be like in this house with this man. The vision was startlingly clear and deeply appealing. "Nathan," she said during a lull in the conversation, "do you remember at the festival when you asked me to consider staying in Silver Creek?" "As part of your life," he nodded, his expression suddenly intent. "I remember every word. You said to ask you again in a month or 2. She took a deep breath. "It's been a month." Nathan set down his teacup, his eyes never leaving her face. "Are you asking, Rose?" "I'm saying yes," she replied, her heart racing. "Yes, I want to stay in Silver Creek. Yes, I want to be part of your life, if the offer still stands." In answer, Nathan rose from his chair and came around the table, kneeling beside her seat and taking both her hands in his. "Rose Lawrence, I've loved you since the moment I saw you standing alone at that train depot, looking like the bravest, most beautiful woman I'd ever laid eyes on. Will you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" Tears of joy sprang to Rose's eyes. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, Nathan, I will." He rose, drawing her to her feet and into his arms. Their first kiss was gentle, a promise sealed with the touch of lips, a beginning rather than an ending. When they finally parted, Nathan pressed his forehead to hers, his voice thick with emotion. "I never thought I'd find someone like you, Rose. Never thought I'd feel this way about anyone." "Nor did I," she admitted. "When I came west, I was seeking security, a new start. I never imagined I would find love." They were married on Christmas Eve in the Silver Creek Church, with seemingly the entire town in attendance. Rose wore the wedding dress she had brought west, though Mrs. Cooper had insisted on adding fresh lace to the collar and cuffs to make it properly bridal. Nathan, in a new suit ordered specially from Denver, watched with undisguised adoration as she walked down the aisle toward him. Pastor Williams performed a simple ceremony, speaking of love, commitment, and the building of a new family. When he pronounced them husband and wife, the cheer that went up from the congregation nearly raised the roof. The celebration continued well into the night, with dancing, feasting, and many toasts to the happiness of the newlyweds. As midnight approached, Nathan and Rose slipped away, boarding the sleigh that would carry them to their home at the Double W Ranch. The night was clear, stars scattered across the velvet sky, the moon casting enough light to make the snow-covered landscape glow with an ethereal beauty. Rose, nestled close to Nathan beneath warm blankets, felt a peace and contentment she had never known before. "Happy?" Nathan asked, his arm tight around her shoulders. "Perfectly," she replied, tilting her face up for his kiss. As the sleigh carried them toward the future they would build together, Rose thought back to that moment at the train depot, when she had stood alone, abandoned by fate, unsure of what would happen next. How could she have known that the greatest blessing of her life was about to take her hand? The years that followed brought many changes to Silver Creek and to the Walsh family. Rose continued teaching until the birth of their first child, a daughter they named Eleanor after Nathan's mother. 2 years later, they welcomed a son, William, named for Rose's father. By the time their third child, another boy they called James, arrived, the Double W had grown into one of the most prosperous ranches in the territory. Rose eventually returned to teaching, not in the schoolhouse but at home, passing her love of learning to her own children and to others from neighboring ranches who rode in for lessons. Nathan expanded his library, ordering books from as far away as New York and Boston to feed his family's voracious appetite for reading. On their 10th wedding anniversary, as they sat on the porch watching their children play in the yard, Nathan took Rose's hand, raising it to his lips in the gesture that had become so familiar and beloved over the years. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked suddenly. "Coming west? Staying in Silver Creek when everything went wrong?" Rose looked at him in surprise. "Regret? How could I regret the best decision I ever made, even though it wasn't what you planned?" he persisted. "You came to marry Jonas Miller, not a rancher you'd never heard of." Rose smiled, turning to face him fully. "Nathan Walsh, in all these years, have you harbored a doubt that I chose you freely with my whole heart?" He shook his head, a rueful smile crossing his face. "Not a doubt about your heart, Rose, never that. Sometimes I just marvel at how it all happened." "If Miller had been at that depot—" "But he wasn't," Rose said firmly, "and you were. You took my hand when I was alone and afraid, and you've been holding it ever since." She leaned forward, pressing a soft kiss to his lips. "I may have come west for Jonas Miller, but I stayed for you. And I have never, not for one moment, regretted that choice." As the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Nathan drew his wife into his arms, still amazed after all these years by the twist of fate that had brought them together. The mail-order bride who had been left standing alone at the depot had found not just a husband, but a love greater than anything either of them had dared to imagine on that fateful day when a cowboy took her hand and changed both their lives forever.